Welcome, everyone, to Women of the Military podcast. I'm really excited to have Joshua Carlson here. I am a space crazy person. My husband's in the Space Force, and we watch, launches all the time. Not as much as we used to, but I really love space, but I didn't really understand it. But my husband read Spacepower Ascendant, Joshua's book. It was on General Gutlein's reading list, and he worked for General Gutlein when he was Colonel Gutlein, and so he started hitting off the books on his list, and he recommended I read it, and I really enjoyed it as someone who's been on the fringe of space and didn't really understand a lot of the technicalities. So I'm really excited to dive in, learn more about you and why you wrote the book, and share it with all my listeners.
Excellent. I'm so happy to be here, Amanda. This is one of my favorite topics. So I'm very excited to get a chance to talk about this. Just up front, giving a disclaimer, as you mentioned, these are my personal views. Anything I say here has no bearing on any policy and is not meant to imply the support of the DoD, the Space Force, Air Force, Army, etc. So having to get that out of the way. I really enjoyed writing the book. In particular, so we were talking a little bit beforehand on the book was originally brought up as, why is China a threat? And so when I originally started writing it, that was actually the question I had as well, because everyone in senior leadership seemed to be very concerned about it as far back as 2013 or so. I started to notice that there was a lot of messaging that China's a threat, China's concerning. But there was never really any particular strategic presentation of this is why it's a concern. It was always, well, they did an ASAT test back in 2007 timeframe, and they made lots of debris, and that's horrible, so therefore they're a threat. That's not a. As I was really reflecting on it, I had a year to go to school and really reflect on this sort of stuff, and the strategic implications of that. I mean, it's a weapon system. There's lots of weapon systems. India recently tested a ASAT successfully, and we don't consider them a threat in the same way that we do China. So clearly, there's something different there. What's the rest of the story? So I had a chance to talk to Namrata Goswami, who's testified before Congress on the threat that China poses, particularly in space and with their space program. And since then, I've also talked to Jonathan Ward, another great thinker on the subject, who has a background in. Both of them have spent, I believe, physical time in China. Dr. Goswami for a year, Jonathan, I think, was also for a year. Both of them have written books. I'd recommend both of them. Dr. Goswami and Pete Gerritsen recently wrote Scramble for the Skies. And Jonathan Ward's original book that put him on the map was China's Vision of Victory. And they have the new one that just came out that was America's Vision of Victory, which talks about, okay, China's trying to do this. Here's what we need to do to counter them. So anyway, got a chance to actually talk to them. So what did I find out? So combining the Chinese intention to expand beyond Earth's orbits and actually have permanent placement on the moon and start to reap the economic and strategic benefits of doing that, and those are significant. That combined with their aggressive nature, and this is where understanding, I would consider the greatest maxim in warfare is know your enemy, know yourself. Which is from Sun Tzu, interestingly enough. And if you do not understand Chinese intentions, then it is possible to misinterpret what they are doing. And Jonathan does a great job of this, so I would highly recommend China's Vision of Victory and his subsequent book. But China's Vision of Victory, he draws a through line from Mao through every single Chinese premier, all the way to Xi, the current one, where they have all preached a China, the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And you have to understand, in Chinese psychology and in their view of history, with some justification, because all narratives have some basing in truth, the Chinese largely, I wouldn't say dominated, but definitely had significant control in the world stage from as far back as we have. There's dynasties as far back as we can go, basically. Up until about 1820, give or take. And in China's perspective, they call it the century of humiliation. That in about 1820, this upstart nation called England showed up and said, "Hey, we would like to trade with you. Not only would we like to trade with you, we have these cool poppies called opium that we would love to give you at a price, of course." And China said, "No, thank you." England said, "Well, you don't understand. We're going to give it to you anyway." And that started the Opium Wars, which eventually basically ended up in the warlords and China largely being desolate for about 100 years. No central government, no strong central government during that time, up until the nationalists and then the communists eventually unified the country by force in 1949 and declared that in 100 years they would be the premier power in the world, returning to their place as the preeminent power in the world system. So why is this relevant to space? Well, the Chinese, from their original rockets, and then have accelerated in the 90s with their space systems, and in the last up until this point, it's very interesting watching the evaluation of this, because originally we're saying, oh well, we did that 30 years ago. Then it's, oh, we did that 20 years ago. Then it's, we did that 10 years ago. And suddenly they just start doing things that no one has done before. Like Chang'e, I want to say it was 3, it might have been 4. They put a comm satellite on the I don't know if your audience is familiar with Lagrange points. So I'll give a quick breakdown. It makes way more sense once you've done that. So any two celestial bodies, the sun and moon, the earth and the sun, any two celestial bodies will generate 5 points of invisible gravity null, if you want to think of it that way. Places you can put stuff in space, there is nothing there. But because of how gravity works, those areas specifically, you can put things in orbit around them. Now, these are massive. These are not small by any stretch of the imagination. But these are 5 points that are strategic, in my opinion. L1 is between the two bodies. So if this is Earth and the moon, L1's here between the two. L2 is on the backside of the object. L3 is back behind Earth in this particular example. And then L4 and L5 are off to the side, about a 45-degree angle from the moon in either direction. The Chinese were the first to put a ComSat in what's called an L2 halo orbit. So they put a comm satellite on the back of the moon in the Lagrange point, and then haloed it around the moon, which means that when they launched they were the first ones also to land on the far side of the moon. When they launched on the back and landed on the back, obviously you have to control your stuff that have on the moon via communications in some way. There's no way to do that, at least not that we know of right now, without having something in halo orbit, which no one had ever done before. They managed it. So now they have a rover on the backside of the moon, not the dark side, the backside. Unlike any nation prior, and we have very limited capability. We can't observe it from Earth because obviously it's on the backside of the moon. We have no capability to use telescopes or anything. And even then, telescopes are very, very difficult to use just based on the distance to the moon, significantly more than GEO or LEO, geostationary orbit or low Earth orbit, for instance.
All these terms my husband uses that I'm like, oh, now I kind of know what he's talking about.
I try to speak slowly and explain acronyms. Unfortunately, some people will talk with acronyms and not realize that not everyone knows them.
Right.
So I try to at least stop and spell them out as I'm using them, with mixed success, in all fairness. So they were able to do that. So that's okay, great. They have a rover on the moon. We've done it. At the time, it was NASA Director Bridenstine, if I recall correctly, was called before Congress, said, "Why are the Chinese catching up?" And he said, "They're not catching up. They went to the moon. We were going to Mars." Okay. That's interesting. That actually gets into space development theory, which is what I bring to the table as a way to think about space. So first of all, I actually respect Bridenstine quite a bit. I think he did a lot of good things. I disagree with his statement. I understand why he had to make it, because obviously he's trying to contrast the two. But in my opinion, there is a weakness in that thinking. It assumes that all missions relevant to space are agnostic as to the purpose. You go to space to explore. Listen, next time you listen as an audience, next time you hear someone talk about space and there's a word after it, see how many times they say space exploration. It's assumed that you are doing space exploration. That's interesting, but by itself, that does not, in my opinion, justify the money or the time that we are spending in space. If all we are doing is exploring, that's not enough, in my opinion, because exploration is the first phase of space development theory. The second phase is expansion, and this is permanent placement of equipment or things on another area. Usually, so how this flows together, when you explore, you're finding stuff, certainly. You're looking for resources. You are looking for scientific interest. Fair. You're also looking for strategic locations, or at least you should be. When you expand, you now put something there to control or speed your access or some benefit, permanent placement benefit in that location. Great example from the America, thinking of this in terms of Europe going across the Atlantic. So 1492, Columbus explored to America. Then he came back. Then other people explored to America. Then they came back. Then people said, you know what? We would like to start some cities there. Jamestown, Plymouth, wherever you want to go with. They expanded to America. Now there's permanent placement there. That starts to change the equation because now you can gather in there. You can, you have a refueling position. You have people living there. And so it starts to change the dynamics of that relationship. And so expansion, so that's the, let's go all the way through and then we'll come back to space actually. So exploitation is the third phase. That is, you now gain more economic benefit than you lose from having that permanent placement. Up until that point, it's a national exertion. You have to go refuel it. You have to bring food. You have to do this. Once you've expanded across and you have farms and you have a small industry, now the colonies at that time, the colonies, the 13 colonies, for instance, are now producing more than they are draining. So it is a net benefit to England at the time to have them. That they have entered the phase of exploitation. Exploitation is often negative. I was trying to come up with an E word. There wasn't much better, so I went with that. But I know it has negative connotations sometimes. In this context, it is not. With a capital E, exploitation. And then finally is exclusion, which can occur at any phase. And basically, this is someone is attempting to take your stuff, or you are attempting to take someone else's stuff. You are attempting to exclude them from a particular location. And so this is often military, and this would be the French and Indian War, which was fought before the Declaration of Independence. England was trying to expand inward, and the French and Indians were trying to stop them from expanding. They were trying to exclude each other from that particular area that the French ended up losing. So those are the phases. Now, how does that apply to space? Well, when Bridenstine says, well, that's great. They are going to the moon. We're going to Mars. The implication, it's far harder to go to Mars. No one else has been, et cetera, et cetera. Great. We've gone to the moon. Up until recently with the Artemis missions, we hadn't been back to the moon in like 20, 30 years. And we explored the moon. We did not expand to the moon. The Chinese have put forward the International Lunar Research Station, the ILRS. And by the way, they have partnered with Russia, and they just had someone else sign on. And unfortunately, I'm blanking on it. But they had another partner sign on too. So that's now the third. Not anything close to I believe it's the 26, 27 that we're on with Artemis, but they are nonetheless trying. And the ILRS is, I would definitely, that is going to be an expansion to the moon. This is going to be a permanent lunar base, almost certainly at the South Pole, that the Chinese are going to have by their own timelines by about 2030, somewhere between 2032 and 2036, depending on the timeline you see. There was some argument they were even going to try to beat 2030, which would be amazing if they can pull that off. I'm not very confident of that. But that is an expansion. That is a permanent placement for the first time in world history of a permanent human settlement on a non-Earth body. That will be significant, very significant. And that is different than going to Mars. If we are going to play this out, and in the book, I have 2 war games that I have as chapters, which are I would highly recommend people read it. It's not a particularly long read and hopefully won't put you to sleep too many times. But the war game goes through what happens if America doesn't expand. It simply explores and stays in orbit. And ultimately, we lose. And it's not even close. We lose very badly. And the reason for that is that if you start looking at space power theorists like Mahan, interesting to pull space power and sea power together. And I'm sorry, Mahan was a sea power theorist. I think I might have said space power. You start to realize he talks a lot about coaling stations, which are refueling points. And then you start to put together the physics of what it actually takes to move to get off of Earth, which, by the way, takes a significant amount of thrust. To get off of Earth requires a Saturn V. But all it took to get off of the moon was the little Apollo lander rocket. That's the difference in gravity, which means it is far, far easier to get off of the moon. And by the way, send resources off of the moon and put them into a space ecosystem than it is to get those same resources off of Earth. It requires significantly more.
Yeah, and I thought it was really interesting how you talked about the Navy and like the different points in like if you read the book, it's a little bit terrifying. You understand like how big of an impact it is, and I think that's why so many people need to read it, and that's why I'm covering it on the podcast, because I think people need to know like why is there a space force, why is space so important, and the way that you explain like how important the US Navy is to America and their ability to control the world, and then how you can translate that into space. It's like this is a really big deal, and we have a short window to be able and we have a short window that we can actually have an impact before China or other adversaries could just close it and not follow the rules that are international guidelines.
So yeah, there's a lot to talk about with that.
I know.
So first off, how fast is this accelerating? So as I mentioned, we landed on the moon 1969. Hooray! One of my favorite things I heard at one point was, there's really only 2 classes of nation. There are people who use the metric system, and then there's people who have landed on the moon. And that's not true anymore. Unfortunately, it was a good taunt for a while. But so America landed on the moon in 1969. The Russians, Soviets at the time, landed on the moon. I believe it was 1976, thereabouts. It was about 7, 8 years later. The Chinese landed on the moon in, I believe, 2013. I might be off on that, but fairly recently, in the last 15 years, India just became the 4th nation to land on the moon. Japan launched another lunar lander in the last 2 weeks, in the last week. I haven't been able to find if it landed successfully yet. But 5 nations, and by the way, India was the first nation to land on the lunar South Pole, which is almost certain, in my opinion, that is where the competition is going to occur, due to some amazing discoveries in the last 10 years. But it's going to be the lunar South Pole, I think, which is where the competition is going to be. They were the first nation to land there. Japan is attempting to compete as well. China and Russia are both in the game. And then obviously America with the Artemis Accords. I think, in my opinion, by 2036 to 2040, you will have a bare minimum of 2 lunar bases on the South Pole and permanent placement from at least 2 world factions, because we are in the middle of great power competition between the United States and China and Russia, or China and Russia on the other side, with largely the United States, Europe, and some of our Asian partners, South Korea, Japan, Australia, that sort of stuff. And you're going to have a significant competition off-world. And this is important because in the history of the world, well, first of all, if you have not read The Expanse, I would highly recommend it. It is really good sci-fi. Interestingly enough, it was actually a capture of a role-playing game that ended up becoming a story. So there are some very shocking things in that story, and part of it was due to the role-playing game. It's very interesting knowing the history of it. That's not particularly important, but what is important is, and we've known this for years, read Mining the Sky or any sorts of books that are background of how much wealth is contained in asteroids. We recently had an asteroid that went by Earth that had more gold than the entire world supply. There is enough iron in the asteroid belt to be able to successfully terraform Mars many times over, to make a complete greenhouse around it and not even utilize a fraction of it. That's not even counting waters and other things that are very useful. Water in space, water obviously has to be there for human habitation, but water is also the currency of space flight, is the way I've heard it described. As you can break it down into its components, oxygen and hydrogen, and you have very basic propellant. And that will then let you get anywhere else in the solar system. And once you're out of Earth's gravity well and you're onto the plane of space, the silent sea, as you will, you can move anywhere in the solar system at a fraction of the cost of delta V, acceleration and movement, utilizing very little propellant because there's not a lot of gravity pulling you anywhere. You don't have to have this big thruster to get off of Earth.
Yeah.
And why is all of this important? Throughout history, nations have been presented with the option of turning inward or expanding outward and helping to amass resources to ensure their own survival. The last major time, I would argue, there's been a couple. The best one I can think of is 1492. We kind of talked about it already with Columbus. 1492, Columbus sailed ocean blue. Everyone knows that part. And Europe, which, by the way, was not a world beater prior to getting the resources of the Americas and the rest of the world. To be clear, like they were fighting external aggression up until I want to say it was 1619 or something like that. Like there was invasions into Vienna, which is right next to Germany in the middle of Europe. They were not world beaters. They were not dominant up before that point. And largely, you could argue the resources that they were able to gather from around the world through trade and other things, they were able to amass an amazing amount of resources that obviously dominant in the 18 and 1900s. But that's the story everyone knows. Most people know. What people don't know, most of them don't, is that in about 1420, give or take, the timing is a little bit hazy. There was Chinese that were actually, they had Admiral Zhang. They still have a replica of his treasure ships in China. Namrata, the lady I mentioned prior, Dr. Goswami, she was there. She saw them. The inscription as well, which says "We will never forget." Because what happened is they also had the opportunity to turn outward. We know they made it at least as far as Africa, because there's an African village that's basically all Chinese DNA. Because there was a Chinese ship that shipwrecked there and they intermarried with the local village. So it's basically all Chinese DNA. We know they made it that far and potentially further. And of course, in the Chinese history books, they play that up as well. Oh, well, we were getting tribute from everyone at that point. We were the most important nation. But what happened? So allegedly the Chinese society, particularly the aristocrats, didn't like the disruptive influences that these outside trading was happening. And so they turned the king against Admiral Zhang. They burned or just let the treasure fleet rot, turned inward for about 400 years. You can do that. That is entirely possible, especially when you're a nation that basically is able to function mostly internally, as the Chinese were able to, from about 1400 to about 1800. Now, if you remember the story, about 1800, some other nations showed up who had, in fact, expanded. Now they have the resources of the world behind them, and the Chinese were not able to resist. The Chinese intentionally, I believe, part of their national rejuvenation is they intend to be the ones to expand this time. And you talked very simply about a couple of things that you have to be considered with space as an expansion, because the space economy right now is projected to be in the hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars per year in the next period, whatever you see within 10, 20 years. And these are projections based off of the current state. I think what's dangerous about looking at space as a current state is it doesn't take into account the physical characteristics of the space and what is possible there. In much the same way that in 1914, the aircraft was considered simply a reconnaissance platform. Not less than 20 years later, they were one of the premier strike craft for basically every advanced military in the world because people had figured out what you could do with them. Same with submarines, I would argue. So you look at space. You have the moon, which has, so the reason that the South Pole is going to be, I think, the area competed for is that based on an Indian probe that went past that was able to identify for the first time that there was water on the moon, and Clementine, which was an American similar satellite that was also able to confirm that there was in fact water on the moon. That, in my opinion, that single event changed just about every equation with space flight and space expansion, because for the first time we had confirmation that there was in fact water close to us that we could use to get out of Earth's gravity well, go to the moon, have a permanent placement there, and then refuel. That, if we're talking about going to Mars, for instance, it is far easier to get to Mars after you've got out of Earth's gravity well. You can refuel on the moon, and then you can burn much quicker to get over to Mars, which, that helps you no matter how you design your spacecraft. You are going to be exposed to the solar radiation for an extended period of time. You're going to try to shrink that as much as possible. That helps you keep your astronauts from getting all green and glowy, which does help with their longevity. So that is certainly a benefit, and that's very, very, very basic space expansion. That doesn't at all. Mars is also interesting. I'm not entirely sure the best argument for that, as you've gone now back down into another gravity while you have to get back out of. The linchpin for me is the asteroid belt. And this is where the expanse comes in place. There is an entire culture of people called belters that do mining and industrial work in the belt, the asteroid belt, and iron, water, all sorts of other resources, gold included, which isn't necessarily useful for bringing back to Earth to sell or put in your stockpile or whatever, but you can use it for other building and manufacturing in space, which is where gold actually could be much more useful there. Yeah. And the economic resources you can get from the asteroid belt dwarf that of the Earth. If putting it in perspective, if you were able to generate a nation that had no holdings on Earth, but they had the complete run, they had bases in deep space, moon, O'Neill cylinders, something like that, and they had stuff in the asteroid belt, and they were able to mass an economy in that form, they would be able to, in my opinion, they would be able to dominate any nation on Earth, if not all nations on Earth, simply because, among other reasons, you would have an incredible ability to move resources. You would have virtually unlimited resources. You would have virtually no concern for pollution or anything like that, because you have literally infinite space with which to produce things industrially. And most important, as you're starting to get into scary concepts, first of all, if you've got asteroid mining, that means that at least in some capability you have, and we're already starting to look at planetary defense, which is a great thing. We need planetary defense. I would certainly not like to be the dinosaurs. But if you can, the scary thing, and why we need to make sure that we have a space force and we have a capability to defend ourselves in space. If you can have a space capability to mine or redirect asteroids, sorry. That means that you can redirect them where you want to. Depending on where you redirect them, especially since it does not take a lot, and some of these are very big, and some of these cause a lot of problems when they hit Earth, if that's what someone would choose to do. We're concerned right now about nuclear weapons. Depending on the size of the asteroid being used and how fast it's moving, that is far worse than any nuclear warhead you could possibly build.
Yeah.
And that's on the purely military. That's the economic, I think, is where you literally make your money. But you have to be concerned about the other military elements of this as well.
Yeah, you got to look at both sides of it. That makes a lot of sense. And one of the things you talked about, like unlimited resources. So, as I guess an altruistic person, I'm thinking, like, why can't everybody be in space and why can't we all make money? But in your book, you talk about like that's not China's plan, and it's not really a realistic, and it's And even though space is limitless, there's key points that if you have control, then you control space.
Yes, I would argue that like any domain, land, air, water, there are certain areas that are strategic to be able to at least project power, if not control. And those apply the same in space. As I already kind of mentioned, the Lagrange points, at least at first, the moon is a huge one. Because if you can't get to the moon, or for instance, if we were nation A and nation A wants to get off of Earth and go to Mars, and nation B controls the moon, and nation B doesn't want you going to the moon, that's a concern.
Yeah.
And between that and the Lagrange points, it would be significantly more difficult to execute something like that than if you had at least a competing base on the moon, if not controlled it yourself.
Yeah. Have you watched the show For All Mankind? It's on Apple Plus.
I have to say,
I
I
know
have heard it many times. I think it sounds amazing. I have to say, I have not had a chance to watch that yet.
it's really interesting to watch. Sometimes you have to be like, well, these writers aren't scientists, but it is a really interesting premise of like, seeing Russia and America fight it out on the moon and different things that happen and how it like changed the world and technologies, and it was really interesting to watch. I think you would enjoy it. You just have to sometimes like shut your brain off about the science because you're like,
It's not
this doesn't
horrible.
quite work. Yeah.
Well, and so that actually brings up something else. So interestingly, that would be very difficult under the current construct to have armed forces on the moon. Simply under the Outer Space Treaty, or OST, that was signed, I believe, in 1966. I might be a little off on the date. Prior to the moon landings, the Russians and United States and a whole bunch of other people ratified it, and it has a whole bunch of stuff. But the important one and relevant to that is you are not allowed to put any armed bodies, read militaries, on the moon or any celestial body, I believe is the wording. I might be a little off on it, but basically, based on that, you are not allowed to put military forces on the moon. So far, so good. So you mentioned earlier, well, China would try to change international norms. Well, yeah, and China has a history of this. China has actively been subverting international norms and blatantly disregarding international findings. A great example of this, which I talk about in my book, is the South China Sea, which China claims and is also claimed by, I believe, no fewer than 5 other nations in that region, particularly the Philippines, which claims several islands. And among other things, China went in there and said, well, this was back, I think it was still Xi at the time. It might have been a prior premier. He was talking to Obama, and they were in the process of building islands. And Obama said, well, we're really not cool with that. That's kind of not, what we wanted. This is in abrogation of international law, etc. And the Chinese basically said, well, yeah, but, we're fishing in the region. We're not going to militarize these islands. We're just using them as harbors. And, we'd really appreciate it. We won't ask for anything more. And then we had, interestingly, tie back into space, we had civilian companies that have imagery satellites that were able to take pictures of those same islands a couple of years later. And they have anti-aircraft batteries and what looks to me like military tarmacs and runways for aircraft, and potentially other force basing as well, which tells me that was probably militarized. Certainly looks like it to me, unless we have different definitions of militarized, I suppose. And ultimately, this is the Chinese basically thumbing their nose at the international community and basically saying, now we're going to do it and no one can stop us. Then they tried to argue that these fake islands that they created, at great expense, by the way, how impart the same claims of national sovereignty that actual islands, naturally existing islands, do. International court basically said you are no, you can't do that. There's no law that even remotely supports that. Doesn't change the fact they've still established air defense zones and no-go zones, and will actively intercept you with aircraft and almost collide into you as they have almost on several instances, not to mention their naval operations as well. And so they, even though there is no international law support there, they are willing to engage in acts of violence or power projection, I guess would be the more politically correct word to say it, that forces people to respect their claim, despite the fact there is no international basis for it. And the most glaring example of this is also when they took the Scarborough Shoals, which was it was a area between them and the Philippines, and they basically came in and kicked the Filipinos off of it, and then took it and said, "Okay, it's ours now." And the Philippines went to the international court and said, "Hey, the Chinese did this. This is an abrogation of international law. What are you going to do about it?" And the international tribunal there came back and said, "Yep, you're right. That is they're an abrogation of international law." And the Chinese basically said, "Yeah, but our legal experts said that's not really binding, so we're not going to really respect that." Once again, you have to understand that, and in my opinion, that is not coincidental. That is a feature. China is a rising power, and they are, in my opinion, they are what in international relations, what's referred to as a revisionist power. They desire to revise the international system in a way that helps them out, that makes them it's more beneficial to them, how it's organized. The current international system, largely after World War II, was mostly orchestrated by the United States, because quite honestly, we were the only ones left at that point. I saw a really interesting share of American industrial capacity over the latter half of the 20th century. And at one point we were like 50% of the world's industrial capacity, and that fell. I think we're like 20% now, something like that. But what's really interesting is it's not that we reduced our capacity. It's actually that the rest of the world's industrial capacity was basically destroyed. And so as a share of that capacity, we were huge at the end of World War II. So we basically made the system that largely it did benefit us, but we were setting it up intentionally to try to never have another World War II, especially now that we had nuclear weapons. And ultimately, China has tried to subvert that and continues to subvert that intentionally, because they don't want that current order. They want to revisit it with another order, as they are allied with Russia. And everyone's aware of just how magnanimous and loving Russia has been with Ukraine over the last couple of years. That's very concerning.
Yeah. Yeah. So I kind of want to shift the focus. We talked a lot about topics that you covered in the book, but went in way more detail. But if someone is listening and thinking, should I get into a career in space? What would you say is like now a good time to be in space? Like, what's the future horizon supposed to be in space?
Yes. So in the interest of full disclosure, space has always had a problem with overpromising, quite honestly, because everyone gets so excited about it and, oh, this is going to happen in 5 years, and then it doesn't, and everyone's like, oh, well, just like the last 4 times you said it. So with that caveat, because clearly there is a history there, and I want to acknowledge that. That being said, 2 things stand out to me that this is stuff that has never happened in space before. 3 things, actually. First is the commercialization of LEO. I would have to say I don't know the exact numbers on it, but for the first time, commercial satellites form a significant amount of the on-orbit satellite pieces, and I would even hazard a guess it might be close to outstripping national capabilities. In other words, more satellites than, SpaceX is launching satellites at a blistering rate. And they're continuing to accelerate. And so the commercialization at LEO, that's never happened before. This is very interesting to observe. And that means that all that commercialization means there is places for people that we need expertise to be able to continue to make that happen. The moon landings, I talked about the first 2 moon landings were 1969 and I believe it was 76. We have had 3 moon landings in the last 10 years, 2 of them, assuming the Japanese were successful. I'll check that after we get off. But 2 of them within the last month. that's an extreme acceleration, and that's not even getting into the NASA CLEPS program, the commercial lunar payloads, where NASA is contracting with commercial companies to build payloads to put on the moon. For the first time, we're having commercial payloads go to the moon. That's also new. That's never happened before. And then finally, you're going to have, in the middle of a international power competition between the United States on one side and China on the other, with other players, of course, but primarily those two, having two bases on the moon, I think by 2036, that will be competing bases. Now, that doesn't mean that war is going to break out a la For All Mankind. The United States and China already have Antarctic bases together, and that we don't, start sniping at each other on the regular. Interestingly enough, actually, the Antarctic Treaty is very close to the Outer Space Treaty, so I think there is some interesting parallels there. I'm not saying that we're going to engage in that, but nonetheless, it is going to be in a time of great power competition. That also has never happened before. We've never had two humans from competing nations be on the moon at the same time, at least not to my knowledge. And so, is this the time to get into space? This is a very exciting time to be in space. And I would say that the problem we have at the moment is we don't have enough people in space, because we need people that have the hard sciences, that have the courage and also the excitement to get into the field and stay there. And there's tons of startups. There's everything from the traditional space contractors like Lockheed, Northrop, to the new, what I would term like the new giants, SpaceX, Blue Origin, and then all of the huge list of up and coming space companies.
Yeah, there is so much.
Yeah, and I don't see that slowing down. If anything, I would assume that will accelerate in the next 10 to 15 years. So I would say this is an awesome time to get into space. And there is also a lot of encouragement from industry and public as well to try to get people into it. So a great time to get into it, and a great time to get a chance to read about it as well. I would recommend my book, Spacepower Ascendant. It was good enough that Amanda had me on, so I have to say that there is something there.
Yeah, no, and it's on General Gutlines. He's a 3-star in the Air or Space Force. I almost said Air Force. Yeah, and I just really think it's really interesting because there's like so much talk, and you mentioned at the beginning like there was like this, why is China, and that's kind of what I've been like, why is China bad? Like what are the details? And it's really I didn't know about, a book like this that would explain it in such a detailed way that really helped open my eyes to like knowing why the Space Force is so important, why the things that, all of the different stuff that's happening in space and why it's so. And then I connected with you on LinkedIn, so I've been following you, which has been really cool because I've been telling my husband, I've been like, hey, look what I saw. But I saw a couple weeks ago you were talking about how the US made a strategic shift and you were really excited. So what has changed since the book has been published with how the US is approaching space, and instead of exploration, are they getting more to the expansion side?
Yeah. So obviously Artemis, I'm wearing the logo for it. I think Artemis is a good step forward. It's a good first step. So since I wrote the book, as the Space Force has continued to mature, I think the Space Force celebrates, I think, 3 or 4 years at this year in
Yeah.
December,
Yes.
2019. Yeah, it should be 4 years, I believe.
Yeah.
And in those 4 years, there is a lot that has gone on. But I think the Space Force has gone through a lot of changes. Obviously, I'm speaking in my own personal capacity here. I do have to say that if I could point to one thing that is a good start, is the new Space Force mission statement that was put out by the chief of space operations, the CSO, General Saltzman. And the old one, I mean, go back and read it if you get a chance. And when you do, listen to Weird Al Yankovic's mission statement song. It is I think it's like 5 lines long. It's like the Space Force will do this, and it will do this, and it will do it for this reason, and it will do this, do that, do that. That's a very, 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 very long mission statement. And quite honestly, I don't know anyone that had it memorized, which is kind of what you want in a mission statement. The new mission statement is that the United States Space Force will protect the United States interests into and from space. I might be a little off on the order of that, but those are the important ones. That's easy. That's, I think, 7-8 words. That shows a significant shift in the Space Force from when it started. I heard almost everyone was talking about the Space Force like the Space Force supports the joint fight. Okay, so the Space Force, a military service, their only job for existing is to support other services. That doesn't sound like a good justification for a military service to me. The new mission statement implies if our job as the Space Force, and when I say our job, speaking as the Space Force from in the context of the Space Force,
Right.
if the Space Force's job is to protect into and from, that implies that there is a mission there that is outside. It certainly supports the joint fight, certainly. But there is this unique mission there that is Space Force only, because no one else has that mission to support into and from. And obviously, yes, the actual mission will be executed thanks to the Goldwater Nichols. The actual mission will be executed through Space Command, which is the combatant command that is responsible for everything over 100 kilometers. So 100 kilometers and up, it's Space Command actually has the authority for that. Space Force, though, is going to provide most of the forces. So that I would point that as one. Some could view that as a minor thing, and it has yet to be seen what exactly that is going to do, and what new shape that's going to have. But the fact that there is a mission statement that clearly says that, that is radically different than anything that could have been or was produced by Space Force, Space Command, or any permutation thereof prior to the actual founding of the Space Force in 2019. So that would be one thing that stands out as this is different. And that's not even talking about, SpaceX and procuring missiles through that, or not missiles, rockets through that way, and various other things. But overall, I see it in a positive direction. And the question is, are we going to be able to successfully compete with China, who is also not sleeping on this? They are also moving quickly, and their ILRS, they are at least some of the various reports now, admittedly from Chinese propaganda, probably. So take it with a grain of salt, 2 or 3, probably better. But trying to accelerate the ILRS, they are definitely not napping. And I mean, we could speak at length on Chinese and the intricacies of the Chinese nation and all this sort of stuff. Unfortunately, I think that would probably be a little long.
Yeah.
But maybe next time.
Maybe, yeah. I think this interview has been so great. It's so eye-opening, and I really hope people do go out and get your book. You can also get it on Audible because it is fairly technical, and it was a great book to read on Audible. And then I also got my own hard copy because I wrote an article for Clearance Jobs, which I'll link to in the show notes. That's actually how we got connected, and so I'm really excited about just learning more about space and not feeling like I don't know what's going on in space. And now I have a greater understanding. And it's just been great to follow you on LinkedIn and be able to see like different things. I mean, a mission statement is so important in business, in a military. And if you're on a mission and you're going this way and you should be going straight, then you're gonna get way off the farther you go. And so the fact that they're shifting their focus, I think it's so important. So thank you so much for your time, for being a guest. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Amanda. Appreciate it.